It is time to start Hosea chapter 10. The prophet Hosea chapter 10. We are going to get through the entire chapter. That's the aim, and let's see how effective I can be here. It's 15 verses, which can be a lot, especially when you're in an Old Testament book and one that people aren't so familiar with. But I will do my best. Hosea chapter 10, starting in verse 1, sounds like this. Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. Yahweh will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. For now they will say, "We have no king, for we do not fear Yahweh. And a king, what could he do for us?" They utter mere words with empty oaths. They make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Beth Aven. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests, those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as a tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high places of Aven, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, "Cover us," and to the hills, "Fall on us." From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they have continued. Shall not the war against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah? When I please, I will discipline them, and nations shall be gathered against them when they are bound up for their double iniquity. Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck. But I will put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow, Jacob must harrow for himself. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek Yahweh, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed iniquity, you have reaped injustice, you have eaten the fruit of lies, because you have trusted in your own way and in the multitude of your warriors. Therefore the tumult of war shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed, as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle. Mothers were dashed in pieces with their children. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great evil. At dawn the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off. Well, we've got a lot to get to, so I don't have much by way of an introduction, except by saying we got to start in verse 1. And there's something very interesting going on in the Hebrew of verse 1. In the translation I just read from, which is the ESV, Hosea calls Israel a luxuriant vine, or we would maybe say in more common terms, fertile. It's a vine that is growing very well, lush. But in some translations, like the New King James, which I also read very regularly, you see the exact opposite word. Something that doesn't mean luxuriant or fertile. And here's why. The word for in Hebrew that is behind this translated luxuriant, bakak, can mean lush, growing, and fruitful, or it can mean empty, barren, and torn down. It all depends on the context. And English has words like this too. I want you to think of some examples. Garnish, okay, can mean to add or to take away. You can go to a really fancy restaurant and they will have garnished your entree with parsley or lemon zest or green onion, those little, I guess, chives you call them. Garnish can be something you add on top of something. But garnish can also mean to take away. You, let's say you didn't pay your car loan, and so legally someone can, the lender can come after you by going to your employer and what's called garnishing your wages. By the time you get your check, they will have already taken money out of it in order to pay for the loan. There are other examples. Skin, for instance, that can mean to remove or to cover something. I can say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And by that we mean to take off its fur, to take off its skin, that outer coating. Or I can say, for instance, as someone who's played the drum set for many years, sometimes people will talk about re-skinning their drums or putting new heads on the drums, the actual pieces that you hit, that material, not the wooden shells, but the heads or the skins. And so you talk about a covering. Or we talk about snake skin boots. That's the covering on the boot, is the skin from the snake, and now it is skinning the boots. There are even more examples. For instance, buckle. That can mean like you're buckling up in your car, or you buckle under pressure. And fast, my last example, can mean to go really, really quickly, or to not move at all, as Paul will say, stand fast, hold fast, meaning be unmovable. So, which is a more accurate way of describing Israel's case? Were they like a tree with tons of fruit, or a barren bunch of branches? Well, in terms of what we know as fruits of the Spirit, they had nothing going for them. But in terms of fruitfulness as defined by the world, they were living their best lives. As it now stood, Israel was having children, enjoying peace and prosperity, and building more altars in honor of man-made idols. They were enjoying successful lives on the surface. God blessed these people and met their needs abundantly. But the more comfortable they got in their country, the more honor and credit they gave to false gods. But that's usually how it goes, isn't it? We tend to use God's blessings, time, money, food and drink, sex, etc., you name it. These gifts of God, we tend to use them for sinful purposes. And whenever we experience some form of material prosperity, we must be on guard to not forget the one who gives us all good things. And usually, whenever this comes up, I am quick to bring up a verse in the Proverbs. It is actually a prayer. It's in Proverbs 30. It's the words of Agur. And we're going to read Proverbs 30, 7 through 9, to talk about this guarding our hearts whenever we come upon material prosperity, which we see was a failure in the northern kingdom of Israel. The words of Agur. 2 things I ask of you. This is a prayer. Deny them not to me before I die. Here's the request. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, Who is Yahweh? or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. I always like to point out how that sounds like a precursor to how Jesus taught the disciples to pray when he taught them to ask for their daily bread. Not an overabundance of physical needs and provisions, but what they needed for today. Well, for Israel, their material fruitfulness led to forgetfulness. They continued to stray from Yahweh, and Hosea diagnoses them with a false heart. More accurately, or more literally, we would understand this as a divided heart. And here, again, we've seen this in previous weeks, Hosea pulls from the punishments listed in Deuteronomy for when Israel would break God's covenant agreement with them, when he speaks about their divided heart, their heart is false, and what would happen. So we're going to look at Deuteronomy 29:18. Beware lest there be among you a man or woman or clan or tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations. Beware lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit. So I think there you have it. This people, their heart is divided. They are turning away from Yahweh, and they are bearing fruit, just not good fruit. They are bearing all kinds of what Moses says here, poisonous and bitter fruit. And at the climax moment of Elijah's life, continuing on this notion of a divided heart, when he had a showdown against the prophets of Baal, his charge to the audience was to not have a divided heart. It's in 1 Kings 18:21. He says, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." But having a divided heart is not just an Old Testament problem. Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters." And James wrote to the Christians who were double-minded in James 4:8. Here's the problem. We're commanded to love God with our whole, undivided hearts. But Paul says in Romans 3 that no one does good and no one seeks God. Even though we may have the desire to love God fully, oftentimes we don't have the ability to make it happen. That's what Paul says in Romans 7. I think we can all relate to the father of that demon-possessed boy who said to Jesus, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief," in Matthew 9. And we are again, I reference this a lot, but I'm bringing it up again, left clinging to the statement made by Paul, "When we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." And we are also left praying prayers like this one from David in Psalm 86:11. "Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name." But Israel, at this moment in its history, had the worst kind of divided heart. At a glance, an outsider might have thought, wow, they've got a strong population, smart foreign relations, and good leadership. What could go wrong? They had a reputation for being alive, but God knew they were dead, similar to what is said to one of the churches in Revelation 3. Based on what the world sees, Israel looked like a healthy tree, bearing fruit, a thriving vine climbing its way up a wall. But in the things that really mattered, they were fruitless and completely misguided. However, I take comfort in this: your salvation, your faith, your security, even the trustworthiness of God and the Scriptures is not based on how much good fruit Israel produced. It's not even based on your own performance. And thank God for that, because we'd all be doomed. Instead, where Israel fails as a vine and where we fail, Jesus Christ succeeds. I want you to hear this from John 15, verses 4 through 6. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. Well, speaking of the failures of sinful people apart from Jesus, listen to what Israel says in verse 3. We have no king, for we do not fear Yahweh. And a king, what could he do for us? Well, in chapter 9, we looked back through the timeline in Israel when the people rejected God and demanded that they be given a human king. Well, here in the time of Hosea, the people are still in that rebellious mindset. And years later, the unbelieving Jews are still rejecting God in this way. Even when God comes to earth as a man to be their king, here's how they respond. In John 19, verses 15 and 16. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to be crucified. The great irony there is the Jews don't care about Caesar. They're just playing the political game and using this system for what they wanted to take place, which was to do away with this Jesus. But even Pilate seems to know that this guy was their king. In verse 4, it says this: they utter mere words, with empty oaths they make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. Well, speaking of fruits, vines, and growth, that's what a lot of the first 3 verses were about. Hosea warns that the consequences of Israel's sin would spring up like poisonous weeds. This could literally be translated as wormwood, which was known as the most bitter plant in Israel. You could see something like Proverbs 5 talks about the bitterness of wormwood. And the cause for this is primarily their empty words, perhaps taking God's name in vain, which means into emptiness. In 5 and 6, it says, the inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Beth-aven. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests, those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. Here again, Hosea identifies the big problem in Israel, or here he calls it Samaria. they trembled, they gathered in worship for a golden calf. And when Assyria eventually came in to steal it, carry it off, after all, it is a big hunk of gold, Israel cared so much about this golden calf that they mourned or cried over it. But when God's glory leaves them, leaves their temple, we don't read that anyone really had any sorrow over it, other than the prophets. But the large mass of people, not so. Verses 7 and 8 says, Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high places of Aven, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Well, once the Assyrians get comfortable with invading Israel and taking whatever they want, they eventually try to overthrow the government of Israel, and they will be successful. When that happens, how will the king fare of Israel? Well, he'll end up like another bad plant, a twig trying to take root in a river, is the imagery Hosea employs. In other words, the king of Israel is going down fast. Next, their high places would be destroyed. Have you ever heard of the high places? These were mountaintop meeting spaces where people would worship idols. It's a practice that King Solomon made popular. And we can read about it in 1 Kings 11, 7 and 8. It says, Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. So these were places on top of mountains and hills where Israel once proudly went to worship false gods. But now, because of God's punishment in the form of an Assyrian invasion, Israel would cry out, to the hills, fall on us, and to the mountains, cover us. Or just collapse the mountains on top of us. That would be a better way to die than God's punishment through Assyria coming in to take them. And interestingly enough, Jesus says people would express this same fear when the temple in Jerusalem was eventually destroyed. In Luke 23:30, it says, they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. And in fact, this is always the reaction sinners have when faced with God's wrath. We even read it in Revelation 6, verses 15 and 16. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. 11 and 12 say, Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck. But I will put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow. Jacob must harrow for himself. Sow for yourselves righteousness. Reap steadfast love. Break up your fallow ground. For it is the time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. Well, this is not the only time that Hosea has compared the northern kingdom of Israel to a cow. He called them a heifer in chapter 4. Before power equipment existed, cows were bred to work a field and also to be eaten or used in the sacrifices. If Israel was a cow, though, they didn't like to work in a field doing the hard stuff. They loved to thresh wheat, which was a much easier job. Threshing wheat for a cow is really just a matter of walking around on top of the wheat to break open the shell and separate the seed from the case. But in that scenario, if God was the farmer and Israel was the cow, he did not make them work hard. He spared their neck from hard work. You have to understand, plows were connected to the shoulders or the neck, and the cow would pull them forward to till the ground. But even though that was the case in past times, that he did not make them work hard, it says now God is going to make these people plow. He will give them the difficult work. Here he gives a command to dig up the hard, crusty, dry ground, a metaphor for their cold hearts, and prepare themselves to become righteous. There's just one problem, though, and it's that God here is dealing with stone-cold sinners. And here's what they end up doing. You have plowed iniquity. You have reaped injustice. You have eaten the fruit of lies, because you have trusted in your own way and in the multitude of your warriors. Therefore, the tumult of war shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed, as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle. Mothers were dashed in pieces with their children. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great evil. At dawn the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off. Israel had no interest or ability in planting good things in the ground or doing good works. They, like all of us, were incapable of preparing their own hearts. Proverbs 20, verse 9 says, "Who can say, I have made my heart pure, I am clean from my sin?" None of us can cleanse ourselves or make ourselves righteous before God. Now, left in this state, we'd have some bad things coming our way. For Israel, they would lose wars and lose their children because of all their sin. But thankfully, God promises to give us what he requires as a gift in the new covenant. We see this in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 30. Ezekiel 36. Verse 25 through 27. I will sprinkle clean water on you. That's the rain of righteousness. And you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. And so he says to each of us today, don't trust in your own way. Instead, trust me. And this is the burden, the workload I'll give you. In Matthew 11:28 through 30, Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And John echoes this in 1 John 5:3. "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." And so then, living as Christians, we can sow or plant things in the ground and experience God's blessings all the more. Paul says in Galatians 6:7-9, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. Amen.